Before the lore guide starts, I must explain a few things. This video will tell the story of Bloodborne in chronological order, emphasizing narrative and fluidity. I will, in the future, make a lore-through series that will feature in-depth analysis of the evidence and trains of thought that led to each discovery. But the lore guides serve to paint a broader picture and reveal, in intuitive and clear manner, the story of Bloodborne, like a book, as opposed to being a string of lengthy explanations and ipsis literis readings of item descriptions. It is important, however, that you understand my method of analysis, which contemplates the whole of Bloodborne, every single aspect that informs of its story, which is told, primarily, through non-textual clues. I will play a truncated excerpt of the first episode of my Dark Souls lore through that briefly discloses my methodology. Feel free to skip this bit if you've already seen it, or if uninterested. In this series, I will play through the games as I explain, in depth, the story, which I must say is not just masterfully written, but perfectly cohesive, and is structured similarly to a work of literature, and not like any world-building project but darker, more cryptic, and exotic, as many seem to think. There is a cast of major characters for each installment, and they all have their own backstories, character arcs, and so on, just like there are minor characters, like most NPCs we meet, and interact with in the games, but on a macrocosmic scale. There are protagonists and antagonists, and all of them have a definitive beginning and ends to their stories that go in line with their narrative roles. There are themes, build-ups and payoffs, recurring motifs, drama, irony, all you'd expect to find in a masterpiece of literature. Most of it is, however, covered by a veil of mystery and apparent ambiguity. There is a highly complex, but concrete sequence of events that happens in the world of Dark Souls, and it is possible to decipher it entirely. However, in order to do so, one must not just be willing to dissect it earnestly and with intent, but also be familiar with the general basis through which the writers created it, as in, one must be a student of history, religion, mythology, of the esoteric, of literature, and so on. Otherwise, there are innumerable failings of communication between the writers and their subjects, since they go out of their way to not just respect his intellect and knowledge, but also to make for him an elaborate jigsaw which he must solve. Each and every claim resulted from years and years of careful, methodic examination. I consider all possible sources of information, from plain text and dialogue to visual design, the placement of items and NPCs, thematic and narrative analysis, references to literature, the names of characters, all of which betray meaning, minor visual details, developer interviews, game mechanics, which are often diegetic, recurring motifs, and so on. I combine them to form a coherent picture in such a way that the blank spaces can be filled not with conjectures, but with informed, logical, and perfectly fitting explanations, so much so that it makes it all seem obvious in retrospect. Since Dark Souls is akin to a work of literature and was written with planning, intent, and the result is fully cohesive, my analysis can reach a high level of accuracy by seeking to distill that which has been written and designed to convey any substance and meaning through a holistic and grounded approach, instead of through the usual one, which is to look at it as though it were a Dungeons & Dragons project, riddled with meaningless details or pointless so-called world-building figments that are perceived as mere disjointed flavor, as if it didn't feature a greater and cohesive narrative. I know how arrogant such declarations seem at first, but rest assured, I mean them sincerely, and I am confident that most who watch this series will understand them and agree with their veracity. It must also be understood that textual clues are seldom inaccurate to an extent in a very deliberate and purposeful sense. Some item descriptions and lines of dialogue are shrouded in propaganda, sprinkled with falsehoods, and more often contain incomplete or misleading retellings of events. Descriptions of items are written from an in-universe point of view, much like the opening narration of each game. There are many instances where they present a mystery to the player instead of solving it, where they contain questions instead of answers, compelling the player to think outside the norm, and form a complex line of thought and web of clues that go far beyond text and dialogue. In Demon Souls, item descriptions are even less informative, often being surprisingly lacking. Its story is hidden, mostly, within visuals, symbols, references to literature, real-world history, mythos, to archetypes, etc., and not in plain text. Text is but one of many layers, an external one as that, in Demon Souls' case, that compose the whole picture. I analyze every symbol, every visual and thematic motif, every writing pattern, and spot them whenever they appear, and decipher both their whole meaning and their individual use. You could say this facet of my methodology is adjacent, partially, to those of Abi Warburg and Erwin Panofsky in their analysis of art and symbolism. My lore videos work differently than others, externally as well. I intend to create one definitive piece at the end of the series, containing the entirety of the game's story, solved to the best of my ability, which will be updated, if need be, as in, revised and re-uploaded, until I consider it polished to a satisfactory degree. It is a long and passionate commitment. I use the pinned comment of each video to share additional information and corrections, and for this one, I'll also be updating it with responses to questions I get, so that viewers can easily access them. Please, feel free to ask me anything, and I'll be glad to reply, as soon as I have the time. I'm both a university student and a private teacher, and I'm also a fine artist and writer. This channel is but a passion project of mine, and most of my free time is dedicated to it, and unfortunately, since I have responsibilities, it's difficult to justify spending as much time as I do when I get so little in return. So if you want to support my work and get access to a Substack-like blog in which I post analysis of the Bible and religion, and of literature, films, music clips, manga, anime, other games, and more, you can join my Patreon. By subscribing to it, or by becoming a member of the channel, you also get access to an exclusive Discord server, in which you can talk to me directly. Subscribing, commenting, and liking the video also helps a lot. Lastly, I'll quickly explain the esoteric concept of the Alchemical Rebis, because understanding it is crucial to be able to grasp even the surface of the stories of From Software's games. The Alchemical Rebis is, basically, the union of opposites, which results in a magnum opus. This united entity is powered by, it stands above, or below the dragon, which can mean either God, Satan, nature, or another greater power or force. A practical example of the Rebis is a Christian marriage, in which a man and a woman become one with the backing of God, and from their vow, new life can be created. A literary, symbolic, allegorical example of the Rebis is the relationship between a character like Aegon Targaryen, the main dragon, and his two sisters, one which represents the sun, one which represents the moon. The three of them as one become a Rebis. With all that said, may you be welcome to the first episode of the complete lore guides to Bloodborne. Initially, all things were condensed in a state of primordial chaos, and then a supreme rupture happened, an event like the Big Bang that fragmented the chaos, creating the cosmos. In primeval times, humanity lived in the underworld, and there it built intricate tunnel systems that hosted civilization. There were 3 tribes of men, each with its own domain, his, Loran, and Pthumeru. These men were pale, as no sunlight penetrated their kingdoms. Their eyes were pitch black, and they were nearly blind, like most creatures that inhabit the bowels of the earth. These ancient peoples would eventually delve deep into the arcane, and commune with outer gods, with beings known as Great Ones. The Great Ones are but parts of what was once a united being. They are the fractured organs of the One Great, segregated pieces of its essence, of that primordial chaos that was like a whole entity, an abraxas. Each Great One stands for concepts, laws, elements of nature, and the cosmos, and they come in pairs of male and female, who are to each other like the yin is to the yang. They are themselves dualistic, and one completes the other. They exist in the Platonic realm of ideas, and can only manifest themselves directly, still in limited capacity, in the dream world, which is the interstice between the material and the astral realms. They are neither good nor evil. They are childlike, curious and carefree, acting merely upon the instincts which their essences dictate. There are 8 Great Ones, but only 4 had their names uncovered by men. Amygdala is, as his name betrays, the Great One that embodies fear and anxiety. But, more generally, he represents the oldest and most primordial, instinctual parts of the human brain. His body is shaped like the reptilian brain, his lower body and tail being the brainstem, his multiple hairy arms, the cerebellar vermis, his head, the amygdala, his namesake. His skeleton exhibits patterns like those of the cerebellar cortex, and his reptilian-looking claws had a literal allusion to the concept of the reptilian brain. The multitude of eyes that pop out of his cranium had a nod to the concept of anxiety itself. When a manifestation of him is attacked, it behaves most impulsively. It vomits as if in a panic. A reflex that's triggered by the medulla oblongata jumps nervously when the enemy comes closer. It severs his own arms to expand the range of his clumsy, erratic movements. By conjuring arcane manifestations of the functions of the cerebellum, the hippocampus, entorhinal, retrosplenial, and parietal cortices, amygdala can manipulate space itself, creating portals with the power to transport men, or even entire locations between layers of existence. The animal most associated with amygdala is the spider, for it is an emblem of primality, fear, and its net is like that of reality itself. Amygdala's pair is, curiously, the great one of death and darkness, the two primary and universal causes of fear and anxiety. As amygdala is reptilian, she is avian. Her form takes the shape of a hybrid between woman and crow, an animal emblematic of death and the occult, and the spiritual connection between worlds. Accordingly, she is the inverse of her bestial husband. She exhibits traits of culture and higher intellect. She is clothed and adorned with silver ornaments, silver being the metal representative of the feminine pole of duality. She wields scythes with her various arms, man-made weapons, in contrast to Amygdala, who must brutally sever his own arms to wield as clubs. And wears a black tunic with a hood that covers her invisible head, like a spectral Grim Reaper. When threatened, she can create a realm of penumbra, in which she can manipulate reality, conjuring aggressive hallucinations, as though one was in a nightmare, or imagining horrific things in the darkness. But beneath her sinister aspect lies a motherly nature. Her embrace is as universal as death itself, and when fear is finally overcome, death becomes an act of compassion, which culminates in a tranquil sleep, like that of a child resting in the womb. Sleep is likewise her dominion, for it is the sister of death. Amygdala and his pair are the most primordial of the Great Ones, having been derived from the earliest ideas to come out of the cosmic implosion that created the universe. Those being awareness of self, which dictated all of existence, and its inverse, the black void of nothingness. Oedon is the archetypal entity of Mercury, of the soul, whose medium is blood, for it flows from the heart, in which it resides. The rune Formless Oedon depicts the deconstruction of the Holy Trinity, with a central human figure representing the Father, flanked by two parallel figures, representing the Son and the Holy Spirit, all connected by an arc that also resembles the central figure's outstretched arms, embracing the others. Oedon's name refers to Odin, the king of the Aesir, the Allfather, whose domain was the occult, who stood for wisdom and magic, and whose name means Lord of Frenzy. Oedon's servants are the messengers, the childlike psychopumps who bathe in plasma. They escort the souls between dimensions, from life to death, and aid them in their passage. However, his omnipresence is invasive, and breaks every boundary. No one can avoid him. He is a violator. For all are one, and he is all. Individuality, to him, is meaningless. Though formless, Oedon is depicted as a hooded, one-eyed sage, similarly to Odin. The rune of the hunter refers to him, and its effect, which is to wake up from a dream and drift into another, is conjured by his law. And the hunter is his unknowing agent, the unconscious Grim Reaper and Martyr, who grants mercy to those who need it, who frees tormented souls, and grants them passage unto the beyond. Oedon is the grand architect of the hunt, as is Odin the leader of the wild hunt. Oedon is a spectral masculine entity that is embodied by the Black Sun, the Dark Soul. His pair is Flora, a feminine entity that is embodied by the Blood Moon. Flora is the archetypal being of blood, of matter. Her form is modeled after the cardiovascular system, with her face taking the shape of the heart, from which the soul is carried through its medium, blood. Her name is, simply, Flora, for plant life is symbolic of all life, and the natural world, of Mother Nature. She, as Oedon, is dualistic, standing both for unbounded fertility, for motherhood, and for war, for the violent shedding of blood, like Freya, Odin's wife. Flora is the provider and the taker of life. Through her unavoidable scream, she is able to bring any man to the brink of death, but in return, that man may reclaim his lost vigor by striking back and inheriting hers. Adjacently, the blood moon is symbolic of menstruation, and when it comes into contact with the earth, it instills a beastly frenzy upon man, as when women experience intensified emotions and cravings during their periods. Indeed, her nature is volatile, has the flowing movements of her many tentacles. The beasts are her agents, for they are eternally vigorous and violent, the pinnacle of life, of all creatures. The hunt is but a game between husband and wife, which, in the end, nurtures them both, at the expense of man. A nameless male Great One, who stands for electricity, for animation, activity, erratic movement, hedonic, and violent impulses. Inversely, he also represents aridity, dryness, scarcity, but temperance. He is the active principle behind one's drive, the energy that confers motion to all things, regardless of prudence or wisdom. He is the action that thinks not of the consequence, and the consequence itself. He is the wind and the hurricane, the thunder and the thunderstorm. This Great One is responsible for the dark beasts, which, in their ultimate stage of transformation, become monsters wholly devoid of flesh, animated skeletons, made of burnt black bones. He can thus be associated with the bone structure. His pair is Cos, the female Great One whose essence is the water, the sea, the calmness of the abyss, the stillness of deep waters, profound relaxation. She is an embodiment of the womb, whose interior peacefully hosts and nurtures life. Negatively, however, she is the devouring mother. She takes hold of all her children, never allowing them to leave her belly, drowning them in the uterine ocean. She is willing to accept everyone into her realm of infinite, maternal care, but won't allow any of them to leave it, and will protect them, and avenge those who are stolen from her, with the power of a mother's wrath. A nameless male Great One, who represents fire, destruction, the obliteration of the flesh, but, inversely, purification, atonement, and a gentle warmth. He is the patron of loyalty and companionship, and his animal is the dog, the man's, the hunter's best friend. He is the adherent of faith and morals, who's honest and foolish to a fault, and whose code and conduct are strict and merciless. His pair is she who makes one a fool, the female archetype of hunger, desire, but also of nourishment and growth, and of manipulation and embroilment. She is the mother of snakes, who start out as pitiful worms, but through opportunism and binge-eating are able to become gigantic and ferocious serpents. She is poison, corruption, the mother of invasive parasites. She is disorder and competition, has even her own creatures fight amongst themselves, and ends up an entangled ball, each of its heads hoping to steal the other's prey. Less developed vermin often infects the same host, and the same scenario occurs. She is the source of strife, but also of strive, of hope, and struggle to overcome impossible odds. She is related to the bowels of man. Thus it was that following the great rupture of the primordial state of the whole, existence was divided into dualities, a dichotomy that can be understood as that between the couples of Great Ones, the relationship between blood and mercury, matter and spirit, sun and moon, between the stats blood-tinge and arcane. It is also reflected narratively, being expressed by the configuration of Loran and Is, Mensis and the choir, Lawrence and Willem. A relevant microcosmic manifestation of it is the archetypal runic language. Runes exist in pairs, and are symbolic transfigurations of aspects of the Great Ones. Beast's Embrace is a beast claw whose tail, which points upwards, is a spiral, indicating that it draws one further into chaotic beasthood, while Guidance is a humanoid shape, gazing at and embracing the cosmos, whose tail, which points downwards, is a spiral, indicating that it draws one closer to the beyond. Radiance is a triangle with an eye. Triangle stands for the masculine, for the phallic energy. Moon is a circular pattern with an eye. Circle stands for the feminine, for the womb. Impurity is a congregation, a league of men, whose leader extends his arms above. Hunter is a singular man hanged upside down, with his hands detached, a symbol of false enlightenment, and the drainage of blood, of death. Blood rapture is a vicious, bloodshot eye, representing hedonic drive, while the eye rune is an eye within a star, representing intellectual, gnostic pursuit. Communion, which illustrates blood ministration, with a central figure joining his arms, forming a drop, surrounded by 3 dots, representing those who receive it, is inversely matched by formless Oedon. Hair is a zigzagging pattern surrounded by dots, representing the widespread propagation of a bloodline, the paternal energy and lineage, while corruption is a curvy, helix pattern, representing the deliberate preservation of an exclusive bloodline, the maternal energy and lineage. Claw mark is aggression, arcane lake is defense. Beast, a 6-fingered beast claw, and deep sea, a 6-fingered alien hand. The metamorphosis runes are 2 swastikas, one, which stands for the beastly transformation, rotating clockwise, representing the sun, the other, which stands for the kin transformation, rotating counterclockwise, representing the moon. And lastly, there's Oedon Writhe, which distills and robs the mercury of one's blood through visceral attacks, and Milkweed, which transforms one into a lumen wood, after contact with a cause parasite. This last pairing is a subtle reenactment of a tragedy of the distant future. Additionally, to writhe is to squirm in pain, to contort, and the rune's effect is applied through ultraviolence, as one steals the mercurial contents of a man. Milkweed is the opposite. Through contact with a parasitic entity, one's body becomes a symbiotic kin being, half human, half alien plant. The violent removal of the spirit through the blood, versus the calm contact with the beyond, through symbiosis. The aim of the Great Ones is to become whole again. They instinctually crave for a return to the primeval womb of existence. They feel akin to a permanent, acute thirst and hunger due to their state of isolation. In desperation, they sought of ways to implant their essence into a whole being, who can bear the children they otherwise can't conceive, for they are lacking beings. Into men, who are surprisingly similar to the one great in their constitution. They are of both flesh and soul. Their bodies are composed of many organs and limbs, as though they are a mixture of every great one, and they are fertile. It was, truly, like they were made in the image of God. Lucky were the great ones, for men also felt like they did, as though they lacked something essential. They desired immortality and wholeness. A deal between a human female, Yharnam, the queen of Pthumeru, and the black king of the cosmos, Oedon, and his red queen, Flora, was struck. Oedon would impregnate Yharnam, who'd act as a surrogate, in trade for special blood, as great ones cannot conceive children with one another, and so Flora, his queen, could never bear his offspring. This event is like a twisted inversion of the birth of Christ. Oedon is like God, who implanted his divine essence into the Virgin Mary. But the resulting firstborn was not the Messiah, but an unholy bastard, and it was essentially traded to the devil so that the mother could attain immortality, a Saturnian ritual of child sacrifice. Kronos devoured his own children so that his golden age would be everlasting. However, the bastard which resulted from the cosmic covenant between the human queen and the king of the Great Ones was never born into the world of man. Yharnam had experienced a stillbirth. Only that stillbirth was not ordinary. The infant had drifted away from reality, leaving behind only an empty vessel. The name of the half-human, half-great one baby was Mergo, a Latin verb meaning to sink, to dip, to drown, to plunge. It refers to the baby having sunk into the dream world. It was neither human nor great one, and it inherited Oedon's nature to a large extent. As a result, it belongs neither in the material world, where Yharnam resided, nor in the ideal, where Oedon existed. It had no form of its own, and its existence was immutable. It would never advance from infancy, and remain forever confused, yearning for its parents. Mergo's formless presence was confined to the interstice, where neither its mother nor its father could embrace it. Its never-ending cries would eternally haunt Yharnam, whose pact with the Great Ones had made immortal. Oedon, being the most occult of the Great Ones, was wholly incapable of manifesting himself as a tangible presence. Mergo's wailing would, however, attract a Great One, the archetypal being of death and darkness. She would become its wet nurse and fierce protector. Despite her morbid essence, she is dualistic, as are all great ones. Her maternal drive was awoken by the weeping of the unborn. The blood of the Pthumerian queen was forever corrupted. As she has desired, she attained immortality in the flesh, but her gift was fostered in nature, and her new existence demanded a terrible price. She, and all who would descend from her, could survive only by consuming the blood of their fellow men. Yet she, and her descendants, gladly embraced that cost, cultivating a wicked, parasitic culture built upon harvesting the blood, the lives and souls of those beneath them, reveling all the while in their cruelty. Yharnam and her lineage were modeled not only after traditional vampire mythology, but also, specifically, a Hungarian noblewoman who kidnapped, tortured, and killed countless maidens to consume their blood in satanic rituals, aiming to preserve her youth, Elizabeth Bathory. Yharnam's blood was pale, so cold as to become purple, the color of the Rebis, the unity of red and blue, as it had been blessed by both Oedon and Flora, with an interior bluish tint. The paler the blood, the closer it is attuned to the eldritch beyond. This truth is expressed in the consumable blood clots. The bluer and colder they are, or rather, the closest to a perfect purple in their alchemical composition, the more echoes they grant. Pale blood is akin to a literal, fantastical interpretation of the notion that royalty was blue-blooded. It also recontextualizes purple as the color of nobility. Queen Yharnam partook in rituals of bloodletting to form alliances with the other tribes of men. She did so to achieve hegemonic control over the totality of human civilization. The rituals consisted of the queen herself, Yharnam, spilling her pale blood into an ornate chalice and handing it to a neighboring ruler, whose drink is to cement a blood tie of communion between them, and their marriage. Thus, both Loran, a tribe emblematic of the sun, and this, a tribe emblematic of the moon, responded to Pthumerian rule, to Yharnam as their supreme leader, for their respective kings had been married to her, forming a trinity and a Rebis, with Yharnam as the dragon. Accordingly, their descendants would become purple-blooded nobles. The tainted blood granted them the mandate of heaven. They were seen as demigods, for they were, truly, beyond other humans. Drinking blood from ornate chalices became thus royal tradition. The crest of the Pthumerian royal family depicted a crouching dragon, the dragon being a dualistic symbol, the philosopher's stone, the mature form of the serpent that was at first a pale worm. It can mean immortality of either the flesh or the soul, hedonism, but also wisdom. Most importantly, it stands for both greed and desire, for insatiable hunger, or for wholeness and sublimity. The dragon is the perfected being, the whole of the animal kingdom, the supreme chimera, a god that can be true and good, or false and villainous, as Satan. The fullness of meanings the dragon conveys is personified by Pthumeru, chaotically so. The bloodline of the Pthumerian nobles was to be preserved. That was their divinely ordained duty. Paradoxically, the noblest blood was born of a profane union that created the worst of bastards, and which mirrors the events that caused men to fall from Eden in Genesis, with Yharnam as Eve, and Oedon as the serpent. And pale blood was to be confined to the select few who belongs to the dynasty that had communed with the Great Ones. Those of foreign origin often struggle to bear the essence of pale blood. They quickly turn into abominations, their bodies implode, and they become uncontrollable monsters. However, the nobility was pridefully ambitious, and their recklessness would cause their eventual ruin. Whenever a bearer of pale blood longed for an interrupted rest, for although his divine blood greatly slowed aging, it didn't halt it entirely, he would request for entombment. Pthumerian priests performed funerary rites intended to grant the tired nobles peaceful rest, and ensure they would never disturb their own slumber. The royals were bound in straitjackets to prevent them from acting upon their impulses, and the final prayer was recited before the coffin was sealed. The priests, draped from head to toe in white tunics and veils, embodies the ideal of immaculate purity. However, beneath that veil, their faces are often disfigured, bestial, inhuman, for they dealt with the dying and faced the consequences. The tombs of royalty were guarded by powerful sentinels. Their duty was not merely to protect the riches entombed with the nobles, but the blood that flowed through their veins. The most common type of servant in Pthumeru were simple-minded brutes, Pthumerian nobles born defective due to inbreeding. Their yoke was often employed for rudimentary and undignified tasks. They disposed of intruders and fed upon their flesh, causing them to grow and bloat horrendously, for that is the effect of man-eating. Should the dead rise as a demon, they stake him down as well. Alternatively, and in stark contrast, the strongest Pthumerian warriors are employed. They covered their faces as to hide the effects of the scourge, which they unpreventably contracted from slaying beasts, but were so loyal, so convicted, they'd never fully give in, preserving their honor and dignity. They fought an endless battle, and so fiercely that their hands became horrifically inflamed. Pthumerian royals were masters of both the blood and the flame arts, and produced powerful, immortal beast-eating watchdogs to loyally protect their tombs. The dogs grew gigantic from their men and beast-eating, and has their stomachs permanently upset from the constant ingestion of tainted blood and decaying flesh. Statues of messengers would line up the corridors of the tombs, some holding lanterns, representing their role as those who guide the spirits into the beyond. Some, however, were traps designed to punish invaders. Other traps and devices were placed throughout the catacombs: guillotines, massive rolling balls, oil fields. Urns holding incense served as beast repellents, to prevent monsters from eating those who are resting. Such repellents are made from the cremation of men. The smell of burning remains wards off beasts, for they fear and are vulnerable to fire. Thieves that were caught by those who guarded the tombs were hanged upside down, so that their blood would get concentrated in their heads until their deaths, a horrific punishment fitting for those who strived for the Philosopher's Stone, for the sacred Paleblood, one emblematic of the false enlightenment which they sought, that doubled as a sacrifice to the gods, to Oedon. Special blood is like an elixir of life. It could heal every ailment, and prolong one's life way beyond its original span. All men coveted it. However, commoners are generally less suitable hosts for Paleblood. The weaker one's essence, the less it takes for its bearer to succumb to corruption. Conversely, the richer one's essence, and the greater the concentration of taint in one's blood, the more powerful the monster he can potentially become. One degenerates into beasthood when a disturbance occurs within that disrupts the perfect balance of Paleblood. The trigger may be one's death, but it may also be a traumatic incident, a moment of extreme distress, the abandonment of one's faith, ideals, or purpose. It is the loss of self, of soul. All vessels of Paleblood are like delayed Molotovs. The metamorphosis may be gradual, as the individual's blood loses its balance over time, or instantaneous. The name of the demonic disease of those who slowly turn into monsters is ashen blood, for one's blood loses its color and quality as his soul leaves his body, turning grey and poisonous. Its most prominent symptoms are progressive memory loss, confusion, mania, and, in its advanced stage, violent psychosis. The eyes of an ashen-blooded man are deprived of sight in proportion to the ruin of his soul, for eyes are the windows to the soul. His pupils grow uncanny in aspect, and the whites become bloodshot. Should a man lose his grasp of himself, even the consumption of blood may prove ineffectual, and so it becomes an ugly vice, and those who transform into beasts are wholly controlled by their thirst for what they lack. The only known treatment for it is the consumption of fresh blood, as the royals do, and they can remain alive and retain their human forms for eons, for they tend to be cold in personality, as is their blood, and thus the plights of mortals are alien to them. Their souls are never disturbed. They were molded to be worthy of Paleblood, desensitized from their infancy. Amputating infected limbs may serve to temporarily deter the disease. The most effective remedy for it, however, comes from within. It is the preservation of one's ambition, of one's faith, conviction, and integrity, even if faced with hell. Loran was a society ruled by religion, its elite classes of the priests. The new generations of affluent clerics, born of the dynastic matrilineage of Yharnam, chose to sanctify themselves by sharing, with all, their special blood, which could cure every illness and rejuvenate men. Yet most were hypocritical and cynical. They were driven not by conviction in equality and the well-being of the common people, but by vile self-interest. They used their bloods to create reliance, to embolden the faith their people had in them, to bolster their wealth with never-ending donations, while being worshipped as selfless gods. Though they ministered their sacred bloods to the lower castes, they were ironically acting as leeches, as parasitic worms, sucking the many of all they had, while disguising their acts as charity and martyrdom. Patients of the clergy developed an addiction to blood, and had to satiate their thirst with bloody cocktails, which were expensive and ended up plunging them further into dependency. They then began to transform into hideous beasts, and the very man who had caused their condition was then ordered their eradication, presenting it as a holy war against demonic forces. The clerics often partook in hunts, conjuring fire sorcery to cleanse the monsters. Fire was widely employed as a weapon for its purifying properties. Whenever a baby was conceived by an infected parent, and was, thus, born with signs of the disease, the merciless priests hesitated not to burn it to ash. Its charred corpse would be offered to the gods, and the woman who'd birthed it faced a punishment even more terrible, for they alleged she'd bedded a demon, and thus produced a devil bastard. She was reduced to cinders as well, but her body was reconstructed by a necromantic ritual, turned immortal, and made to wear a witch's hat as a mark of shame. She'd be tasked with eternal service, hunting beasts with flame sorcery, and protecting the tombs of nobility as a mindless golem, as penitence. Such a ritual was learned from Pthumerian nobility, who'd mastered the flame art before them. While religious fanatics on the surface, preachers of temperance, the holy men are vulgarly materialistic. They flaunted their wealth through lavish jewelry and indulged in hedonistic excesses. They were impulsive, heretic in their disposition. They behaved like beasts themselves. They were wolves in sheep's clothing. As such, they took the most demonic forms when the scourge afflicted them. The lesser clerics continued to wear their white and gold vestments, emblems of purity and virtue, but beneath them, they had transformed into dark beasts. Their noses became long, crooked, and pointed, betraying their deceitful nature. Immense and swirly devilish horns crowned their heads, while their tongues grew into those of serpents. The higher clerics transformed into black, horned lycanthropes. Their faces expressed naught but savagery. They were wolves, now unclothed. But despite their complete descent into the taint of the devil, they yet cast their flames of cleansing as their foes. Even warriors of Loran proved faithless in the end. The mightiest among them, whose weapons were forged from the bones of the powerful beasts they had slain, faltered in the oath they had sworn when entrusted with guarding the eternal slumber of their lords, and had to be bound in chains to prevent them from fleeing. Their last undertaking was so contrary to their hedonistic, heretic nature that their bodies ceaselessly tremble, as though on the verge of bursting from the strain of the true asceticism and servitude. The name Loran is retroactively related to that of a messianic figure that will rise in the distant future. The men of His, on the other hand, were curious and intellectual. They thirsted for arcane knowledge, and experimented extensively with the sacred blood they now possessed. They wished for eyes on the inside, to communicate with the cosmos, and become one with it, to transcend the material plane, and their bodily vessels. And just as the clerics of Loran are hypocrites, were men of faith who committed the worst sins, the enlightened scholars of His were, in truth, the most foolish among men. They knew no dogma, and would, unscrupulously, break all taboos in their quest for elucidation. They performed horrific surgeries on men, scalping them, and extracting their brains in search for eyes. Those brainless patients would not remain dead due to their special blood, but rise from death as alien abominations, whose sole drive was retrieving that which they had lost. So, they'd be known as brain-suckers. They'd roam the tombs in search of coffins to defile, and prey to assault. The culmination of the scholarly pursuit of His was the creation of artificial eldritch beings. The paleness of Paleblood, the soul which it contained, was distilled and injected into men, turning them into kin of the cosmos. They'd go as far as experimenting on pregnant women, and a parcel of the resulting female infants, for the female nature is more receptive than the male, that has their essence changed within the womb, grew. If they didn't physically stagnate as infants, which was an exceptionally common occurrence, to become daughters of the cosmos. The existence of such beings was tragic. They were stuck between two worlds, neither of which they belonged to. They were the most solitary among all orphans. Their minds were as simple as those of babies, still, precisely like those of true great ones. The umbilical cords of these special half-breeds were harvested and consumed by scholars. When 3 umbilical cords were consumed, one ascended into the state of a vacuous, spider-like replica of a great one, a being emblematic of the foolishness attained in pursuit of elucidation, whose head is solid rock. Some depraved scholars went mad and began to collect the eyes of unsuspecting victims, in crude fashion. His is a name derived from the English is, and it relates to the question surrounding existence. They of his desires to transcend theirs. Pthumeru remained obsessed with transcending death, and its culture and societal order was shaped around their demonic worship of the Great Ones. The lower classes were used as fuel for evil rituals conducted by priests and nobles. No plebeian was safe from the grasp of royalty. After all, they had to sustain their immortal lives with blood, and they did so unabashedly. Shamanic witches who worn the skulls of the dead as charms provided horrific offerings to the outer gods. With the bones of their victims, they made knives, which they doused in spinal fluid to induce paralysis, an effect that allows them to perform grotesque operations in living victims, such as the removal of still active organs, which served as more valuable gifts to the Great Ones. They wielded severed hands, the palm holding an eye, as talismans, with which they conjured their dark magic. Their suppliers were priests, who roamed the streets in search of easy targets, carrying huge sacks with which to kidnap them. Grieving widows of nobility performed sacrifices and rang sacred bells, whose chimes beckoned the souls of departed loved ones, manifesting them through blood so they could be reunited. The necromancers of Pthumeru had created Frankenstein's monster-like creatures to guard their tombs. Multiple corpses were butchered and stitched back together as one sole being, with weapons in place of hands, and were reanimated with special blood to serve as a golem. The undead giants, as they were called, suffered constant infection, their rotting flesh erupting with foul, suppurating pustules. Whenever a man succumbed to the plague and transformed into a beast, knights were dispatched to hunt it down. Yet, when attacks came unexpectedly and entire communities fell victim, civilians often had no choice but to confront the creatures themselves, for the beasts preyed indiscriminately upon any human they encountered. The enemies of humanity faced organized resistance. The commoners formed hunting squadrons to combat the catastrophe. Most were led by a watchman, some of whom held a lamp in one hand and a gun on the other, to hamper the beasts. He was followed by a group of men wielding axes, sickles, and saw-tipped spears to slash them to pieces. Inbred brutes also joins the hunt, with the incentive of eating delicious beast flesh. These squads patrols the tunnels in search of prey. However, even when men succeeded in defeating the demons, the issue was not quelled, it was often exacerbated. The ill which afflicted the men who transformed into beasts was Bloodborne. By exposing themselves to an excess of tainted blood, and to stressful, traumatic situations, the hunters were next in line to become monstrosities, which would lead to further proliferation of the scourge. Furthermore, merely handling a corpse that had come into contact with a beast, or even a wounded victim, could be enough to spread the contamination. If a single drop of the beast's blood had stained the body, the taint was present. Soon, almost every man, woman, and child had tainted blood in their veins, and most could not handle it. All fell to ruin. Loran had been overwhelmed by the plague, and answered it with boundless zealotry. They hunted with a ferocity greater than that of the very beasts they pursued, until nothing remained but ashes. They burned down their own civilization, until it was reduced to a desert of cinders, as false shepherds preached for purification, tirelessly, as their minds waned from the scourge, and only malice resided within them. That was the origin of the sands of Ailing Loran. Its downfall befits a society driven by excess, hedonism, ostentation of material wealth, and gluttonous blood consumption. His, conversely, was engulfed by nebulous mist and astral mucus, as though overtaken by a flood of its own making, a fitting doom for a society that placed collecting eyes on the inside, attaining knowledge, above all else. They brought the cosmos to their lair, and it consumes them entirely. All that remains are beasts and artificial kin. Some, the victims of insane experiments, others, the very scholars who willingly experimented upon themselves. Even the blue-blooded Pthumerians weren't immune to the consequences of the calamity. The highest nobles became bloodletting beasts, the largest monsters of them all. Those who slumbered within their coffins crawled out of their confinements. The women degenerated into pale, long-tongued beasts, driven solely by an insatiable hunger. Their bellies would become swollen, pregnant with fertile blood, and they would then birth white worms, creatures symbolic of incomplete dragons. The man assumes the likeness of the crouching dragon, the ancient crest of Pthumerian royalty, stalking their prey through stealth and ambush, like living, predatory gargoyles. The two transformations were guided by the egregore of the royal bloodline itself, taking shape according to its collective ideals and unconscious psyche. Pthumeru, as its neighbors, had become a twisted parody of itself. Female monsters obsessed with licking bloods to give birth to parasites, and male monsters who hid in plain sight, and assaulted the weak to bite their necks and drain their blood, were what remained of the once prestigious, divine nobility. The underworld civilizations, whose trajectory had culminated in the worship of blood, death, and its transcendence, evolved into an undead necropolis, where mindless laborers toiled endlessly to expand their inert empire, building infinite hintertombs, while beasts, mutated wildlife turns demonic after consumption of pale blood, and monstrous vampires roamed its boundless depths. Immortality was made into the most terrible curse. Man knew they had to forsake all they had created, else they'd be consumed. The situation was unsalvageable. Urgent, critical action was needed. A mass exodus would ensue. And, in the direst of moments, an opportunistic branch of nobility, House Cain, rose against their queen. They imprisoned her in Mergo's tomb, declared her dead, and left her behind, in shackles, so they would shine in her stead. She did not protest her fate. Guilt, and her baby's cries, consumed her. Humanity had no choice but to leave their home. They embarked on pilgrimage to the world's surface, where they would struggle, but ultimately succeed in rebuilding civilization. The first city they erected was called Yharnam, in homage to the supreme leader of Pthumeru,